Welcome to Swift Tale. If this is your first time visiting the channel, I'm thrilled to have you here. Before we dive into today's jaw-dropping story, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with friends, and of course, subscribe for more incredible stories just like this one. And if you're already a part of the Swift Tale family, welcome back. Now let me ask you a question. What would you do if you were in a place where everything seemed calm, normal, and routine, only for a shocking act of violence to rip through that peace? And just when it seems like there's no hope for justice or control, imagine this. Minutes later, 3 military generals arrive, ready to take charge and change everything. Sounds unbelievable, right? But that's exactly what we're going to dive into today. In this story, we're going to explore a violent encounter that happens on a seemingly ordinary day. A man strikes a woman in the face, setting off a chain of events that would rock not just the individuals involved, but the very foundation of a military base. What happens next is something straight out of a movie, but it's real. This is no fictional account. It's a tale of power, authority, and how fast everything can change when you least expect it. But why does this matter? Why should we care about a situation that seems so far removed from our daily lives? Well, this story speaks to a much larger theme, the fragile balance of control in our world. It's a reminder that the forces we often trust to maintain order, whether it's law enforcement, military, or even social structures, can sometimes shift the course of events in an instant. And the way those in power respond can completely alter the fate of everyone involved. Stay tuned as we break down the full story and uncover what happened when the generals arrived and shut everything down. Before we get into the heart of the story, it's important to understand the setting, because in a situation like this, where power and control are at stake, the environment plays a huge role in shaping what happens next. The story takes place on a military base, a highly secured area that should be free from chaos and violence. It's a place where discipline is the order of the day, where every soldier has a role to play, and every action is governed by strict rules and protocols. The base is a world of its own, isolated from the outside, with its own rhythm and routines. But beneath this surface of structure and control, there are always the potential for tension, secrets, and conflict, and that's exactly what sets the stage for what's about to happen. At the heart of this story are two individuals, a man and a woman, whose lives will collide in an unforgettable way. The man, a soldier stationed at the base, is not just any random person. He's a man with a temper, someone whose emotions can spiral out of control when pushed to the edge. On the other side is the woman, a member of the base staff who has been working alongside him for a while. The two don't have the best relationship, but it's not one that would normally lead to violence. Yet something snaps in this moment, something that pushes the man to strike the woman in the face. It's a shocking and violent act that catches everyone off guard. The suddenness of it sends a ripple of shock throughout the base. As word quickly spreads, everyone begins to react. The soldiers, once focused on their duties, stop in their tracks. Some look on in disbelief, unsure of what to do next. Others feel a sense of fear, fear of the unknown, fear of what might happen next. Tension quickly builds as people begin to understand the severity of the situation. The woman, bruised and disoriented, is left in shock. Meanwhile, the man who struck her seems unfazed, perhaps thinking there will be no real consequences for his actions. But in a place like this, where everything is supposed to be under control, this kind of incident cannot go unnoticed. What happens next is a series of rapid, unpredictable events that will change everything. The tension in the air is thick, and it's clear that the base is on the brink of something much larger than a simple domestic altercation. This is where the power dynamics shift and where everything that seems secure starts to crumble. The arrival of the generals, minutes after the incident, will completely alter the course of this situation. But before they arrive, the question remains: how will those on the base react to such an act of violence, and what consequences will follow? It's often said that the smallest spark can ignite a wildfire, and on that fateful day, the spark was a seemingly minor altercation, one that would escalate into something far beyond anyone's expectations. The air on the military base was thick with the usual tension of everyday life. Soldiers running drills, staff performing their duties, and a steady hum of activity that suggested all was well. But beneath the surface, there was something brewing, unspoken frustrations, conflicts that had simmered beneath the routine, and the inevitable human tensions that any close-knit environment, especially one like this, would foster. It was in this charged atmosphere that the violent incident took place. The man, let's call him Sergeant Turner, had always been known for his temper, quick to anger and even quicker to act. He wasn't particularly well-liked among his peers, and his interactions with the women on base were often tense. Today, however, something was different. He and Corporal Miller, the woman in question, had been exchanging harsh words for days. A conflict that had started as a disagreement over routine duties had snowballed into a bitter feud. The tension had been building for days, like a powder keg waiting for a spark. And that spark came suddenly. The confrontation started as just another heated exchange in a corridor, voices raised, tempers flaring, but it escalated when Turner's frustration reached its boiling point. Without warning, his hand flew out, striking Miller across the face with a force that stunned everyone who witnessed it. The loud slap echoed through the corridor, a sound that seemed to hang in the air for a moment, as if the entire base had frozen in shock. Miller, reeling from the force of the blow, stumbled backward, her face a mix of pain and disbelief. Her hand instinctively shot to her cheek, but it was clear she was in shock, her eyes wide, unable to fully process what had just happened. For a split second, time seemed to stand still. The soldiers who had been nearby in the middle of their own tasks suddenly stopped and turned toward the scene. There was silence. No one knew how to react. Some soldiers looked away, unwilling to get involved. Others took a step forward, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. But the damage was already done. The moment the strike landed, the atmosphere on the base shifted. It wasn't just an assault. It was an open challenge to the order that had been upheld for so long. What happened next was as much a reaction to the violence as it was a direct result of the vulnerability exposed by it. Corporal Miller, stunned but with a quiet resolve growing within her, locked eyes with Turner. She didn't speak at first, she didn't need to. Her eyes said everything, a mixture of hurt, shock, and anger. As Turner, perhaps realizing what he had just done, began to step back, an uneasy tension hung in the air. Would there be consequences? Would anyone dare challenge a superior officer in a place like this? Or would this act of violence go unpunished, dismissed as just another incident in the chaos of military life? In the seconds that followed, as the soldiers around the base absorbed what had just transpired, an even greater question loomed on the horizon. What would happen next? How would those in charge respond to a moment like this, where violence had broken through the facade of discipline and order? Little did anyone know, the arrival of the generals was imminent. Their response would be swift, and it would change the entire course of the situation, setting in motion a chain of events no one could have predicted. After the violent incident, the atmosphere on the base became thick with unease. The events of the day had rattled the foundations of the orderly military life everyone was accustomed to. What had been a momentary flash of anger had now created a storm of uncertainty. Sergeant Turner's outburst left more than just a physical mark on Corporal Miller. It left an emotional and psychological scar on the entire base. And with that, the base's fragile equilibrium began to unravel. As Miller stepped away from Turner, still in shock, the soldiers who had witnessed the slap exchanged uneasy glances. Some were confused, others were afraid, and a few seemed uncertain of how to respond. In a place where hierarchy and discipline reigned supreme, what had just happened was unthinkable. For those who had worked with Turner, this wasn't entirely out of character, but it was still shocking. There had been rumors about his volatile temper, but no one expected it to manifest in such a violent, public manner. This wasn't just a scuffle or a heated argument, it was a direct assault. The tension spread quickly. Whispers began circulating throughout the base like wildfire. Soldiers who had been in the vicinity of the altercation gathered in hushed conversations, trying to make sense of what they had seen. Some were concerned for Miller's safety, others fearful of the repercussions that might follow. No one knew exactly how the higher-ups would handle this. Would it be swept under the rug as some minor incident, or would it spark a full-scale investigation? Regardless, it was clear that something had to be done, and soon. The power dynamics within the base also began to shift. Turner, for the moment, seemed unbothered by what had just transpired, as if he believed he could simply walk away without consequence. But those around him knew better. There was no ignoring an act of violence like this, especially in a place where order and discipline were the very backbone of daily life. The soldiers around him, who had once respected him for his rank and authority, now found themselves questioning him. Could they trust a superior officer who had crossed such a line? Meanwhile, Miller stood still, holding her cheek, her emotions a whirlwind of confusion and anger. The physical pain was sharp, but it was the humiliation and the breach of trust that cut the deepest. She had been part of this base for years. She knew the rules, the hierarchy, and the expectations. But now, those very rules seemed meaningless in the face of such an unforgivable act. She felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders, knowing that her next steps would not just affect her, but the entire base. And yet, even in the midst of the growing tension, something was happening in the background that no one expected: the military's response. Word of the incident had already begun to make its way up the chain of command. Within moments, the rumor mill shifted from talking about Turner and Miller to something far more ominous: the arrival of high-ranking military personnel. Speculation began to spread. The generals were coming. The question was no longer whether action would be taken, but how swiftly and decisively it would be. As the minutes ticked by, the uneasy silence grew heavier. The soldiers continued their work, but the focus had shifted from their tasks to the growing sense of anticipation. In the distance, the unmistakable sound of military vehicles could be heard approaching the base. The generals were on their way. Everyone knew that when figures of such authority arrived, things were about to change. The base, once a controlled environment, was about to be thrown into a storm of scrutiny, and there was no turning back. What would happen when the generals arrived? Would they restore order, or would their presence escalate the situation even further? The answers to those questions were about to unfold, and no one, not even Turner or Miller, could predict how this would all play out. Minutes after the slap echoed through the hallway, the atmosphere on the military base shifted from tense confusion to a charged anticipation. In the midst of the whispered conversations and the stifled murmurs of soldiers and staff, there was one looming question: how would the higher-ups respond to such an unprecedented act of violence? The usual chain of command had failed to contain the situation, and the tension was palpable. But then, the sound of heavy vehicles rolling into the base cut through the silence. The generals had arrived. The convoy, a series of armored jeeps and military trucks, rolled up the main road with an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. The hum of the engines seemed to resonate through the base, cutting through the underlying nervous energy that had built up in the wake of the altercation. The soldiers who had been loitering around the area straightened up, the weight of their uniforms suddenly feeling heavier, as they instinctively knew that the presence of the generals would change everything. These weren't just any military leaders. They were figures of immense authority, each with years of experience and power that commanded both respect and fear. As the vehicles came to a halt, the air seemed to freeze for a moment. The three generals who stepped out were unmistakable, each towering in stature and presence. General Hayes, the commander of the base, was a man known for his cool-headed demeanor and strict discipline. His reputation preceded him, his decisions were calculated, his actions swift, and his ability to quell even the most volatile situations had earned him the respect of his subordinates. Alongside him was General Clark, a no-nonsense officer with a reputation for taking immediate action, and General Donovan, a strategist known for his ability to read a situation and move with precision. As the generals made their way toward the central command post, the soldiers fell into a hurried silence, their eyes following the trio as they moved with purpose. It wasn't just their rank that made them stand out, it was their presence. Their every movement exuded authority, and the soldiers instinctively understood that the arrival of these figures meant that something major was about to happen. There was no longer room for hesitation, no more waiting to see how things would unfold. The time for action had arrived. Inside the base's command center, the generals were briefed quickly on the incident. The reports came in fast and frantic, outlining the altercation between Sergeant Turner and Corporal Miller. The situation was far from simple, and the gravity of the assault weighed heavily on the minds of those presenting the details. The generals listened intently, exchanging knowing glances. They were no strangers to conflict, but this was a different kind of challenge. The base had always prided itself on maintaining order, and a direct act of violence, especially involving someone in Turner's position, was not something they could allow to stand. General Hayes, ever the leader, wasted no time in giving orders. His voice was steady, yet it carried a cold precision that left no room for doubt. "Gather the personnel involved," he said, his tone commanding, "and I want a full report on the situation. No one leaves until we've got all the facts." It was clear that Hayes wasn't going to allow any ambiguity in the chain of events that had led to the violence. Every detail, every witness, every piece of information would be scrutinized under his watchful eye. But it wasn't just the immediate military personnel that had to be accounted for. The generals understood that what had occurred on the base was not just a personal dispute, it was a breach of the very order that governed the lives of everyone there. The base had been thrown into chaos, and that chaos needed to be extinguished immediately. The swift and decisive response from the generals wasn't just about punishing the wrongdoers, it was about restoring control. As the generals moved through the base, their presence was undeniable. Even the most seasoned soldiers felt the weight of their authority. Their arrival was a clear signal to everyone. This was no longer a matter to be dealt with in the usual way. This wasn't a simple disciplinary issue, it was a military incident, and it required the kind of swift, decisive action that only the highest-ranking officers could provide. The generals weren't just there to oversee, they were there to take command and ensure that the situation was dealt with in the most effective way possible. And as they moved closer to the scene of the altercation, one thing became clear: the base would never be the same after today. The power dynamics had shifted, the rules had changed, and the generals were about to make sure that those who thought they could act with impunity would face the consequences of their actions. The arrival of these high-ranking officials was the calm before the storm, a storm that would shake the base to its core. With the arrival of the generals, the entire tone of the situation shifted. No longer was this a matter that could be handled by regular chain-of-command protocols. The moment the three men stepped onto the base, it was clear that military authority would take over, and everything would be viewed through the lens of strict discipline. The base, which had been teetering on the brink of chaos, now faced an ironclad response, one that would leave no room for negotiation, no room for leniency. General Hayes, the commanding officer, was the first to address the situation head-on. His gaze, sharp and unyielding, surveyed the area as his team followed closely behind him. Every soldier in sight knew the weight of his presence, and the base fell into a tense stillness. Hayes didn't waste time with pleasantries. His first order was clear: "I want Sergeant Turner and Corporal Miller in front of me now." Within minutes, Turner and Miller were brought to the central command post. The two of them were separated from each other, Turner standing stiff and seemingly unbothered, while Miller was visibly shaken, though her resolve was beginning to solidify. Turner, his demeanor still one of arrogance, likely didn't understand the gravity of the situation. After all, in his mind, this was just another heated argument that had escalated. But to the generals, this wasn't just a petty conflict. It was a breach of military protocol, an act of violence that could not and would not be overlooked. General Hayes took a long look at Turner, his face unreadable. "What happened?" he asked, his tone calm, but there was an underlying menace in his words. Turner responded with a nonchalant shrug, trying to brush off the seriousness of his actions. "Just a misunderstanding, sir," he said, attempting to downplay the situation, but the generals weren't buying it. In the military, even the smallest infraction had a ripple effect that could cause irreparable damage to morale, discipline, and the very fabric of the institution. Turner's lack of remorse only made the situation worse. But the generals weren't interested in Turner's justifications. They were there to find the truth, to understand what had happened, and to restore order at any cost. General Clark, standing off to the side, shot a look at the soldiers who had gathered to witness the scene. "Get the witness statements now," he ordered. His voice was sharp, like a blade slicing through the air. There would be no delays, no waiting for things to calm down. This was an emergency, and it was being handled with the urgency it demanded. As the witness statements were gathered, it became clear that the altercation wasn't just a one-off event. There had been prior tension between Turner and Miller. The two had clashed before, and this wasn't the first time Turner had shown signs of aggression. But what was most alarming was the pattern of behavior that was now emerging. Turner had not only assaulted a fellow service member, but had done so in a public and reckless manner. And worse, he seemed to have no understanding of the consequences of his actions. The generals, understanding the gravity of the situation, began to discuss their options. The decision wasn't going to be easy. In a place like this, where hierarchy and rank were everything, taking action against a superior officer was a delicate matter, but there was no room for ambiguity. Miller had been assaulted, and her safety and well-being were paramount. The rules of engagement, so to speak, were clear. Turner's actions had crossed a line, one that could not be overlooked. "What's the recommendation?" General Donovan asked, turning to the other officers in the room. There was a brief silence as everyone understood what needed to be done, but no one wanted to say it aloud. Finally, General Hayes spoke, his voice steady and unwavering. "He's a threat to the stability of this base. He will be removed from duty immediately. We'll handle this through the proper channels." With that, the decision was made. Turner's fate was sealed. The generals had taken command of the situation, and their authority was absolute. The base was no longer just a place of military protocol, it had become a battleground of power, discipline, and control. Every action from here on out would be scrutinized, and the consequences would be swift and severe. But the question remained, how far would this go? Would Turner's removal be enough to restore order, or was the situation about to escalate in ways no one could predict? The arrival of the generals had undoubtedly brought the situation under control, but the true test would come in the days ahead, as the aftermath of their decision began to unfold. With Sergeant Turner removed from his duties and Corporal Miller still reeling from the physical and emotional impact of the incident, the atmosphere on the base had shifted dramatically. What had once been a tight-knit, orderly military environment now felt more like a powder keg, waiting for the next spark. The arrival of the generals and the swift action taken against Turner had begun to restore some semblance of control, but the true test would come in the form of the investigation. This wasn't just about punishing one individual. It was about uncovering the full truth behind the incident and determining how such a breach of military conduct had occurred in the first place. The generals understood the importance of a thorough investigation. General Hayes, in particular, was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his unwavering commitment to justice. He wasted no time in assembling a team to handle the inquiry. The investigative unit was made up of officers who were respected for their objectivity and their ability to handle high-stakes situations without letting personal biases cloud their judgment. The goal was clear: uncover exactly what led to the altercation between Turner and Miller and determine whether there were deeper, systemic issues at play. The first step in the investigation was to gather statements from everyone who had been present at the scene. Witnesses, soldiers, and staff members who had seen or heard anything related to the incident were called in for questioning. The room where these interviews took place was tense. Everyone knew this wasn't just a routine inquiry. People were nervous, and some were even afraid of the repercussions of speaking up. The military base, after all, thrived on hierarchy, and any deviation from the established order could lead to consequences, both personal and professional. As the interviews unfolded, a troubling picture began to emerge. The tension between Turner and Miller wasn't just an isolated event, it was part of a larger pattern of behavior. Several soldiers reported having witnessed past instances of Turner's aggressive behavior, some of which had been brushed aside by higher-ups as minor infractions. The more they dug into his past, the clearer it became that Turner had been allowed to operate with impunity, his temper and volatile nature overlooked by those who had the power to intervene. But now, with the assault on Miller in full view, the past couldn't be ignored. But the investigation wasn't just about Turner, it was about the broader culture of the base. Was this kind of aggression something that had been allowed to fester in silence? Was there a deeper issue with how conflicts were handled on the base, particularly when it came to the treatment of women in the military? Miller's statement, though filled with pain and frustration, revealed a disturbing pattern of subtle but persistent mistreatment and belittling from some of her male colleagues, Turner being the most egregious example. It became evident that the atmosphere on the base, while outwardly structured and disciplined, might have been far more toxic than anyone had realized. As the investigation team continued to dig, the pressure mounted on the generals. They couldn't afford to let this slide. The incident had already shaken the foundation of their control, and the revelations coming to light threatened to expose deeper flaws in the base's internal workings. What started as an investigation into a single violent outburst was quickly evolving into something far more significant, a potential reckoning for the entire command structure. And in the background, murmurs began to spread. Were the generals willing to expose these systemic issues, or would they protect the institution at all costs? Miller, for her part, was unwavering in her desire to see justice served. The physical pain from Turner's slap was fading, but the emotional toll lingered. She felt betrayed not just by Turner's actions, but by the military system that had allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. As she sat down for her own interview with the investigators, she was resolute in her stance. She didn't want revenge, she wanted accountability. She wanted to make sure that no one else had to endure what she had experienced. Meanwhile, Turner, who had been confined to a holding area while the investigation continued, grew increasingly agitated. At first, he tried to brush off the gravity of the situation, convinced that the generals would side with him and dismiss the incident as a misunderstanding. But as the interviews continued and the evidence mounted against him, his confidence began to crack. He knew that he was in serious trouble now, and that the swift response from the generals was only the beginning. The investigation was far from over, and he could feel the weight of its progress pressing down on him. The base was on edge as the investigation unfolded. Soldiers, staff members, and even civilians working nearby began to wonder how deep the rot really went. Could Turner's actions truly be the result of a single incident, or were there larger institutional issues that had allowed his behavior to thrive? And more importantly, what would happen when the investigation concluded? Would the generals make the tough call and demand real change, or would they let the incident slide, hoping the base would return to its normal routine? With every passing hour, the tension built. The investigation was revealing cracks in the facade of military discipline, and it was clear that no one, was going to be allowed to remain untouched. The generals, determined to see this through, were committed to rooting out the truth. The outcome of the investigation would not only determine Turner's future, but it would also decide whether the military base could continue to operate with the same sense of order it once had, or whether it would be forced to confront a much darker reality. As the investigation into Sergeant Turner's violent outburst continued, the fallout from the incident began to reverberate across the military base. The generals who had initially stepped in to restore order were now faced with an entirely different challenge, managing the damage done not just to the individuals involved, but to the entire structure of authority and discipline that had been compromised. The cracks in the system, once invisible to many, were now impossible to ignore. Corporal Miller, though still shaken, began to feel the weight of the entire situation on her shoulders. She had hoped that the investigation would bring clarity and justice, but as the hours turned into days, it became clear that the implications of the case were far more profound than she had initially realized. The interviews, the statements, and the evidence all painted a picture of a base where tensions were simmering beneath the surface. Turner's actions were far from an isolated incident. His violence was a symptom of a larger, toxic culture that had been allowed to fester unchecked. And now, Miller was caught in the middle of a battle that wasn't just about her or Turner. It was about the very integrity of the military. Some sympathized with Miller, rallying around her as a symbol of courage in the face of abuse. Others, however, were reluctant to acknowledge the deeper issues at play. Many had witnessed Turner's behavior in the past and knew of the tensions between him and Miller, but they had always assumed it was just another disagreement. It wasn't until the violence had erupted that the true scale of the problem was revealed. Yet some of Turner's supporters were vocal in their defense of him, claiming that he had simply acted out of frustration, a frustration that was, in their view, understandable given the pressures of military life. This division further complicated the investigation, as the generals had to sift through conflicting narratives while trying to maintain order on the base. The generals themselves were facing immense pressure from higher-ups as well. The situation had escalated beyond the base itself and was now a matter of public interest. News outlets had begun to catch wind of the story, and the once contained incident was rapidly turning into a full-blown scandal. It wasn't just about a violent altercation anymore. It was about the culture of violence, aggression, and power imbalances within the military. If the generals failed to act decisively, they risked further tarnishing the military's reputation, potentially undermining years of discipline and hardened respect. But if they acted too harshly, they risked alienating their own ranks and causing an even deeper fracture in the chain of command. In the midst of this, Miller found herself caught between her desire for justice and the realization that her personal experience was now part of something much larger than herself. She had become a symbol, whether she wanted to be or not. Soldiers around the base now looked to her not only for courage, but for leadership, as they grappled with the harsh truths that were emerging from the investigation. Miller was no longer just a victim, she was now a focal point for the potential change that was needed. But the weight of that responsibility was not lost on her. As she sat in interviews, giving testimony, she felt the pressure of her words, knowing that whatever she said could influence not just her own future, but the future of everyone on the base. For Turner, the investigation's fallout was starting to take a toll as well. Once a respected officer, he now found himself isolated, his past actions hanging over him like a shadow. His attempt to downplay the incident, to brush it off as a simple misunderstanding, had failed. The generals were no longer willing to entertain excuses or justifications. The evidence of his history of aggression and the testimonies of those who had witnessed his behavior painted a damning picture. Turner, once so sure of his place in the military hierarchy, was now beginning to realize just how far he had fallen. As the investigation continued, his anxiety grew, and the bravado he had once exhibited began to crumble. It wasn't just his career that was on the line, it was his very reputation, and perhaps even his freedom, that now hung in the balance. The general sentiment on the base had shifted. What had initially been seen as an isolated incident had now spiraled into a full-blown crisis of confidence. Soldiers who had once trusted the command structure were now questioning whether the system was truly fair. Those who had witnessed Turner's behavior for years began to wonder how many other incidents of aggression, intimidation, or unfair treatment had been swept under the rug. The generals, who had once been seen as unassailable pillars of authority, were now under the microscope themselves. Their handling of this case would be closely scrutinized, and any misstep could result in a loss of confidence from both their subordinates and the higher command. As the fallout continued to unfold, it became clear that the military base was facing a crossroads. The actions of one man, Sergeant Turner, had exposed deep flaws within the system. The question now was whether the institution would be able to confront these flaws head-on and make meaningful changes, or whether it would revert to old habits, protecting its own reputation at the cost of justice. For Miller, the personal ramifications were significant. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: this was no longer just about one incident of violence. It was about the future of military culture itself. As the investigation into the violent altercation unfolded, the pressure on the generals to make a decisive move mounted with each passing day. The base, once a place of disciplined order, had become a battleground of opinions, loyalty, and fear. Everyone, from the soldiers to the staff to the higher command, had a stake in the outcome. And yet, despite the complexity of the situation, the generals knew one thing: the decision they were about to make would not only affect the individuals involved, but also the integrity of the military institution itself. General Hayes, who had taken charge from the moment he arrived, sat in a dimly lit conference room, surrounded by the other two generals. The weight of the decision rested heavily on his shoulders. He was known for his steady hand and his ability to make tough calls, but this situation was different. This wasn't just about punishing a soldier for a breach of conduct. It was about confronting a systemic issue that ran deeper than a single violent act. The base's reputation was at stake, but more importantly, the trust that had been built between the soldiers and their leadership was beginning to crack. If they didn't handle this carefully, the entire structure of authority could be undermined. "I'm not going to lie," General Hayes began, his voice low but resolute. "This isn't just about Turner, it's about the kind of base we want to run here. It's about what we tolerate and what we won't tolerate. If we let this slide, we're sending a message that this behavior is acceptable, and that's not a message I'm willing to send." General Clark nodded in agreement, his expression hard. "We've got a choice here, Hayes. We can make an example of Turner, but we also need to address the underlying culture. If we don't change that, this will just be the beginning. This base needs to know that we stand for something more than just order. It's about respect. Respect for everyone, regardless of rank or gender." General Donovan, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of experience. "We have to make it clear that the chain of command can't protect behavior like this. If we fail to act now, we'll lose the respect of the men and women who serve under us. They need to see that we're not just punishing an individual, we're holding the system accountable." The generals sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of their decision settling in. Turner's fate had already been sealed in their minds. He would be removed from duty, and his actions would be met with serious consequences. But the bigger question was what kind of message they would send to the rest of the base. Would they allow the issue to be swept under the rug, or would they take this opportunity to address the deeper cultural issues that had allowed Turner's behavior to thrive? Finally, General Hayes stood up, his decision made. "We'll remove Turner from the base immediately, and he'll face a court-martial. But that's not enough. We'll initiate a full review of the base's policies on handling abuse, harassment, and violent behavior. There will be mandatory training for everyone, officers, enlisted, and civilian staff alike. And we'll start building a system where no one is above reproach. No one is allowed to violate the trust that binds us together. This has to be the beginning of real change." As the generals discussed the finer details of the action they would take, a sense of relief began to settle in. They knew this wouldn't be the end of the story. There would be backlash, there would be resistance, and there would be difficult conversations ahead. But at least, for the first time in a long while, they were facing the problem head-on, instead of pretending it didn't exist. And then, as Hayes looked out the window of the command center, a realization struck him. This wouldn't just affect the base, it would send a message to every military unit, every leader, and every service member across the country. They were setting a precedent, one that said violence, harassment, and abuse would not be tolerated, no matter the rank. It was a message that would echo through the military ranks for years to come. The next step was clear. It was time to address the base, to stand before the soldiers and staff and make the decision public. They needed to see that leadership was committed to change and that the generals, while powerful, were also accountable to the very people they commanded. The base had been rocked, but now it was time to rebuild. And that rebuilding would require more than just removing Turner from the equation. It would require a full commitment to integrity, respect, and a military culture that could truly stand as an example for the rest of the world. The morning after the generals had made their decision, the mood on the base was one of palpable anticipation. News had already spread about the investigation and the swift action taken against Sergeant Turner. Soldiers and staff members were talking in hushed tones, exchanging opinions, and speculating about what would happen next. Everyone knew that the general's decision wasn't just a matter of one man's fate, it was a turning point. The base was about to be confronted with a change that could fundamentally alter the way they operated and interacted with one another. General Hayes stood in front of the gathered soldiers and staff in the base's central courtyard. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete, and there was a quiet tension in the air as the troops assembled. The generals, along with key personnel from the investigative team, stood beside him, their expressions serious. Hayes had already briefed the higher command about the situation, and now it was time to address the soldiers directly. "I won't waste your time," Hayes began, his voice steady and commanding, carrying across the courtyard. "Yesterday we had an incident on this base, one that should never have happened. Sergeant Turner's actions, as well as the culture that allowed them to continue unchecked, are a disgrace to the values we hold dear in the military. No matter what your rank is, no matter your service, you are all bound by the same code of conduct. That code demands respect, accountability, and integrity." Turner violated that code, and as a result, he will be removed from his post and face a court-martial. There was a slight murmur in the crowd. For some, this was what they had hoped would happen, the swift removal of someone who had crossed a line. For others, there was uncertainty, a feeling that the decision might signal more change than they were ready for. The room was divided, but General Hayes' words left little room for ambiguity. However, Hayes continued, his gaze sweeping over the group. This is not just about Turner. This is about the kind of military culture we want to cultivate here on this base and in every branch of service. We cannot afford to ignore problems, to brush things under the rug, or to let abuse, harassment, or violence go unchecked. That's why I'm announcing a comprehensive review of our policies regarding conduct, training, and conflict resolution. We will be implementing mandatory workshops and seminars focused on respect, integrity, and dealing with aggression. This will not be the end of the conversation, it is just the beginning. The soldiers listened intently, some nodding in agreement, others looking uneasy. It was clear that the generals had taken bold steps, and there was a sense of discomfort in the air. Change of this magnitude, especially within such a rigid system, was never easy. But Hayes' words carried weight, and for those who had been waiting for accountability, it was a step in the right direction. Additionally, Hayes added, we will be working with an external team to review the culture of this base. This isn't about scapegoating anyone or making examples of people. It's about ensuring that every soldier here feels safe, respected, and valued. If we are going to continue to stand as an example of military excellence, we need to hold ourselves to the highest standard. And we need to work together, every single one of us, to make this a place where honor and respect come before rank and power. As Hayes spoke, there was a noticeable shift in the crowd. Some soldiers straightened up, perhaps out of respect, while others exchanged looks that suggested they were beginning to process what this change would mean for them. The mood, once one of discomfort, was starting to morph into something more hopeful. Change was hard, but it was also necessary. And for the first time in a long while, there was a sense that they were moving toward something better, something more aligned with the ideals they had pledged to uphold. As the speech ended, General Hayes stepped down from the podium, his gaze meeting Corporal Miller's from across the courtyard. She stood with her head held high, no longer the victim of a single violent act, but a symbol of resilience and the catalyst for change. Miller had faced an unimaginable ordeal, but now she was seeing the beginnings of real transformation. She had helped to expose the cracks in the system, and now, with the general's actions, those cracks were being addressed. But the work was far from over. The path to true change would be long, and there would undoubtedly be resistance. Turner's court-martial would be a public spectacle, and many on the base would be watching closely to see if the generals could back up their words with consistent actions. The training programs, the policy reviews, and the cultural shift would take time to fully implement, and not everyone would agree with the changes. But the seed of transformation had been planted, and it was clear that the base would never be the same again. For Corporal Miller, the day marked a personal victory, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt overlooked, disrespected, or unsafe in the system. The assault, though traumatic, had sparked a larger conversation about military culture, and now, with the general's decision, she could see a future where her experience might not be in vain. As the soldiers began to disperse, returning to their duties, there was a lingering sense of unease, but also a flicker of hope. The generals had acted, and they had committed to making the base a better place for all. The question now was whether the soldiers, staff, and leaders would embrace the change and work toward a new standard of respect and accountability. The foundation had been laid, but the real work was just beginning. In the days following the general's public address, the mood on the base remained tense, though there was a subtle shift in the air. Some soldiers were emboldened, energized by the prospect of real change and accountability. Others, however, were unsettled, unsure of how the new directives would impact their daily lives and their relationships with their superiors. The general's commitment to a broader cultural shift was being met with mixed reactions, praise from those who had long felt the weight of institutional indifference, and resistance from others who saw the reforms as a threat to the established order. The first sign of resistance came quietly, through whispered conversations in the mess hall and behind closed doors. Some of the older officers, particularly those who had served in the military for decades, began to question the need for such drastic changes. "This is the military, not a kindergarten," one veteran officer muttered to a fellow colleague as they sat in the break room. "We don't need these new respect programs to tell us how to behave." Their dismissive attitude reflected a broader sentiment among those who believed that the military's strength had always been rooted in discipline, hierarchy, and adherence to tradition. To them, the push for cultural reform felt like a shift towards softness, a dilution of the core values that had made the military an institution of power and pride. Meanwhile, some of the younger soldiers, who had been silently enduring the toxic aspects of base life, felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time in their careers, they saw leadership taking action to address the very issues that had long been swept under the rug. They were the ones who had quietly watched as fellow soldiers, like Miller, endured harassment or disrespect, but felt powerless to speak up for fear of retribution or ostracism. For them, the general's decision signaled a shift toward an environment where they, too, could thrive without being subjected to the kind of mistreatment that had been considered a norm. But as the days wore on, it became clear that hope alone wouldn't bring about lasting change. The system, entrenched and resistant to outsiders, would need more than a few policies to truly transform. Corporal Miller, for her part, felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. While the announcement had brought some sense of justice and acknowledgement, she knew that real change wasn't going to happen overnight. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched by some of her peers, soldiers who might resent her for pushing the issue to the forefront. She overheard one conversation in the hallway as she passed by, where a group of male soldiers discussed the coddling of the military and the dangers of overreacting to a single incident. There was a palpable sense of discomfort among certain factions of the base, and Miller knew that as much as the generals had made a stand, there were still soldiers who didn't understand, or outright rejected, the necessity of the reforms. But there were also those who reached out to her, offering support and thanking her for speaking out. A few women in the unit, who had been enduring subtle forms of mistreatment for years, took Miller aside and expressed their gratitude. It was clear that the general's decision had created a ripple effect, allowing those who had long suffered in silence to begin speaking out. Miller had become a symbol for these women, a reminder that it was possible to challenge the status quo and survive. Yet despite this newfound support, Miller knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. The resistance wasn't just from the older generation of officers. It was a deeply embedded mindset that ran through every level of the base's hierarchy. Turner, meanwhile, remained largely isolated. The once proud sergeant, whose bravado had made him a commanding presence, now found himself facing a court-martial that would determine his future. Behind bars, away from the base, he had little power to resist the fallout from the decision. But as the investigation and subsequent media coverage unfolded, his supporters began to speak out. There were rumors among the soldiers that Turner wasn't the only one responsible for the toxic environment, that others, particularly those in leadership roles, had allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. Some soldiers whispered that Turner was simply a scapegoat, the one who had gotten caught, while others had been able to get away with similar actions. These murmurs of dissent further complicated the situation, as it became clear that Turner's removal wouldn't automatically erase the deeper issues plaguing the base. As the week progressed, the generals worked tirelessly to address the fallout. General Hayes, who had made the decisive call, found himself in a delicate position. On one hand, he had to support the reforms he had announced, ensuring that the new policies were implemented effectively. On the other hand, he had to manage the fallout from the more traditional elements of the base who saw the changes as unnecessary or damaging. There were long, closed-door meetings with commanders and senior officers to discuss how to handle the cultural shift. While some of these conversations were productive, others revealed a deep resistance to change. Some officers were still in denial, unwilling to acknowledge that Turner's behavior was part of a larger problem that needed systemic reform. But Hayes wasn't backing down. He understood that while resistance was inevitable, the long-term success of the military depended on confronting the uncomfortable truths of its culture. The base's training programs were soon updated, incorporating new modules focused on communication, conflict resolution, and recognizing the signs of abuse or harassment. These programs were met with mixed reactions, but the generals remained steadfast in their belief that this was the only way forward. As the weeks turned into months, the atmosphere on the base slowly began to shift. The conversations that had once been confined to quiet murmurs in the corners of the barracks now spilled into the open. Soldiers began to engage more openly with the changes, some with reluctant acceptance, others with newfound enthusiasm. For Miller, the road to healing was still long. The trauma she had endured at Turner's hands would take time to overcome, but the support she now received from her fellow soldiers gave her hope that things would eventually improve. She knew that her battle wasn't over, that there would be resistance, and that the cultural change the generals had promised would take time to truly take root. But for the first time, she believed that real transformation was possible. And as she watched the base slowly begin to change, she couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. The battle she had fought for herself had sparked a larger conversation, and in doing so, it had become the catalyst for something much bigger than one incident. The question now was whether the changes would stick. It was whether the soldiers, the officers, and the leaders of the base would embrace the responsibility that came with it. The true test had only just begun. The day of Sergeant Turner's court-martial arrived, and the atmosphere around the base was thick with anticipation. The court-martial was the culmination of weeks of investigation, public scrutiny, and intense emotional turmoil for those involved. For Turner, it was the moment of reckoning, the day he would face the consequences of his actions, both the violent altercation with Corporal Miller and the underlying patterns of behavior that had led to his downfall. Turner's once commanding presence was now a shadow of its former self. No longer the confident, brash sergeant who had commanded respect and fear among his subordinates, he now stood before a military tribunal with his head bowed, shoulders slumped in resignation. The man who had once boasted about his military career now found himself fighting for his future, his reputation in tatters. His legal counsel, a seasoned military defense attorney, had done their best to mount a defense, but the evidence against Turner was overwhelming. The court-martial proceedings were methodical, clinical even. Turner's actions were examined under the harshest of lights. His history of aggression and prior warnings were laid bare, as were the testimonies of several soldiers who had witnessed his behavior over the years. The general sentiment in the courtroom was one of disbelief that someone of his rank could have gotten away with such behavior for so long. Many in the military had long held Turner in high regard due to his past accomplishments, but the more the investigation had unfolded, the more it became clear that he had used his position to manipulate and intimidate those under his command. Miller sat in the back of the courtroom, her emotions a mix of anger, relief, and a profound sense of justice. Her decision to press charges had set this entire process in motion, and though she didn't seek to be the center of attention, she had become the face of the movement to bring Turner's toxic behavior to light. She didn't take satisfaction in seeing Turner stripped of his rank and reputation, but she did feel vindicated. She knew that, for the first time in years, the military was finally acknowledging the harm that had been caused, not just to her, but to others who had suffered in silence. The court-martial moved through the various stages, the opening statements, the presentation of evidence, and then the testimonies. It was clear that Turner's defense was struggling. He was unable to convincingly argue that his actions had been justified. He tried to claim that the altercation with Miller had been a result of stress and a breakdown in communication, but his defense faltered when the investigators presented evidence of his prior aggressive behavior. The damning testimonies of fellow soldiers who had witnessed Turner's behavior over the years added weight to the case against him. The tribunal listened in silence as one after another, witnesses recounted how Turner had used his position of power to manipulate and intimidate those who were in vulnerable positions. As the trial drew to a close, it was clear that the outcome was all but certain. The court would deliver its verdict, and Turner's future in the military would be irrevocably changed. But there was still one final step: the sentencing. The military court took several hours to deliberate, a decision that would likely set a precedent for how such cases were handled in the future. When the verdict was finally announced, it sent a ripple through the courtroom. Turner was found guilty on multiple charges of misconduct, including assault, harassment, and abuse of power. The sentence was harsh. He was stripped of his rank, dishonorably discharged from the military, and banned from ever serving in any capacity in the armed forces again. The decision was a clear message from the military leadership. There would be no tolerance for this type of behavior, no matter who you were or how high your rank. For Turner, the dishonorable discharge was a bitter pill to swallow. The pride he had once taken in his uniform, his rank, and his reputation had all been stripped away in an instant. He had gone from being a respected leader to a disgraced former soldier, a cautionary tale for others who might think their behavior would go unchecked. It wasn't just his career that had been ruined. His entire identity as a soldier had been shattered. As Turner was escorted out of the courtroom, Miller's gaze followed him. She didn't feel pity for him, she didn't feel anger either. She just felt a quiet sense of closure. The decision had been made, and it wasn't just for her. It was for every soldier who had been too afraid to speak up, for every woman who had been dismissed or overlooked, for every person who had felt the weight of toxic masculinity within the military. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And more importantly, it was the beginning of a new chapter. For the base, the verdict was a turning point. It marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the military could no longer pretend that these issues didn't exist. It would take time for the changes to fully take hold, but the foundation had been laid. The culture of silence and fear had been shattered. The ripple effect of Turner's fall from grace would echo through the ranks for years to come, reminding every service member that they were accountable for their actions, no matter their rank, no matter their status. For Miller, the day of the court-martial was the closing of one painful chapter and the opening of another. Her healing journey was just beginning, but she now had the confidence to believe that the military, her home for so long, could change. The road ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time, she felt like she was walking it with others who shared her vision for a better, safer, and more respectful military culture. In the weeks following the court-martial, the base began to settle into a new normal, though it was clear that change, while inevitable, was not always easy. For Corporal Miller, the aftermath of Turner's court-martial was a time of personal reflection and gradual healing. Her role in exposing Turner's behavior had opened wounds she hadn't even known she had, emotional scars that, while not visible, weighed heavily on her. Yet, there was also a sense of empowerment that came with her newfound voice. The base was different now, and so was she. The challenge now was not just to process the trauma of the past, but for the first time in a long while, Miller felt a sense of support from her peers, support she had never fully experienced before. While there had been some lingering resistance, most of her fellow soldiers were beginning to accept the changes. Conversations in the barracks were less about the past and more about the future, about how they could build a culture that respected and valued each individual regardless of rank or gender. There were still moments of tension, particularly in the training rooms where old habits died hard, but the groundwork had been laid. The new programs, focused on respect, harassment prevention, and emotional intelligence, had begun to take root. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Miller had always been driven by a sense of duty, a commitment to the military and the values it represented. But over the past several months, her perspective had shifted. She now realized that the military didn't just need soldiers who could follow orders, it needed soldiers who could hold each other accountable and speak out when something was wrong. Miller's own journey had been a testament to the power of standing up, even when it was uncomfortable, even when the cost seemed too high. She had shown that one voice, one person willing to take action, could start a ripple effect of change. The generals, too, had a long road ahead. Though they had made the right decision by holding Turner accountable, they knew that their work wasn't done. The cultural shift they had promised was still in its infancy, and the results would take time to fully manifest. They continued to monitor the success of the new programs and were open to feedback from soldiers at all levels of the base. General Hayes, in particular, was invested in ensuring that the lessons learned from the Turner incident would not be forgotten. He had promised the soldiers that they would be given the tools to succeed in a healthier, more respectful environment, and he was determined to follow through. There were still challenges, of course. Some of the older, more traditional officers remained skeptical, and there were whispers about the softening of military culture. But the generals had made it clear this wasn't about making the military less disciplined, it was about making it more inclusive and more aware of the human side of service. The commitment to respect, both on and off the battlefield, was now an integral part of the military's code of conduct. It was about ensuring that every soldier, regardless of gender or rank, could thrive without fear of harassment, intimidation, or violence. For Miller, the road to recovery was long and often painful, but it was also full of small victories. She found herself opening up more to her fellow soldiers, seeking support where she had once kept her distance. She was no longer the quiet, reserved soldier trying to blend in. She had a voice, and she was learning how to use it, not just for herself, but for the people around her. Her bond with the other women on the base grew stronger as they began to unite over shared experiences, and their collective strength became a powerful force for change. They spoke up for each other, supported each other, and worked together to ensure that the military base would be a place where everyone could feel safe. In one of her quieter moments, Miller sat on a bench overlooking the base's training fields, watching the soldiers as they went through their drills. It was early morning, and the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the landscape. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. The battle for justice had been won, and while it had come at a high cost, it had also brought her clarity. The change that had begun with her own courage had sparked a broader movement, and now it was up to her and her fellow soldiers to carry it forward. Miller was still processing the emotional toll of everything that had happened. She had witnessed the fall of someone she had once respected, but more importantly, she had helped to expose the toxic culture that had allowed such behavior to thrive. That was the true victory. The base was changing, and so was the military. Though she knew that there would always be more work to be done, Miller was confident that the path to recovery was clear. It was a path that would take time, effort, and constant vigilance, but it was a path toward a better, safer, and more inclusive environment for everyone who wore the uniform. As Miller stood up and walked back to her barracks, she felt a quiet determination settle within her. She was no longer just a soldier in the system, she was part of the change, and with that realization came a renewed sense of purpose. The military, with all its traditions and structures, had a long way to go, but she would be there every step of the way, pushing for the culture she knew it could become. As the months passed, the base underwent a quiet but profound transformation. While the formal investigations had concluded, the real work was just beginning. The generals, the officers, and the soldiers had all been swept up in the whirlwind of change that had followed Turner's court-martial. But now, the true test was whether these changes would stick, not just as policies on paper, but as part of the lived experience for every service member. General Hayes, who had been at the forefront of the reforms, found himself increasingly involved in the day-to-day atmosphere of the base. He attended more briefings with lower-ranking soldiers, listened to their concerns, and worked to ensure that the new initiatives were being implemented with sincerity, not just as a formality. His leadership was no longer solely about tactical expertise or military strategy. It was about fostering an environment of trust, respect, and accountability. He had come to understand that the true strength of the military wasn't just in its might, but in the cohesion and integrity of its ranks. The changes brought about by the reforms were visible in the small, everyday moments. Soldiers offering a helping hand to one another, officers engaging in more meaningful conversations with their subordinates, and the previously silent voices of women and minorities becoming louder and more confident. While it would be naive to think that the transformation was instant or complete, the foundations had been laid. It wasn't just about new training sessions or codes of conduct. It was about cultivating a culture where respect wasn't just encouraged, but demanded. Miller, now more confident and connected with her fellow soldiers, found herself assuming a quiet leadership role. It wasn't something she had sought or anticipated, but the respect she had earned through her actions made her a natural figurehead for the soldiers on base who were still hesitant about the changes. She wasn't perfect, nor did she claim to be. But her journey had given her a unique perspective, one that others began to rely on as they navigated the evolving culture of the base. She had become a sounding board for soldiers who were struggling with the new policies, and even for some of the senior officers who were trying to reconcile their previous experiences with the new military ethos. Miller's perspective, though shaped by pain and loss, was invaluable. She had lived through the worst of what the old system had allowed, and now she was a key part of helping her peers adapt to the new order. The new training programs were still in their infancy, but they were slowly showing results. The mandatory workshops on conflict resolution, respect in the workplace, and emotional intelligence were gaining traction. At first, there was resistance, especially among those who had been in the military long enough to feel that these soft programs were unnecessary. But over time, many of them began to see the value in learning how to communicate better, understand the perspectives of others, and address conflict without resorting to aggression. The base wasn't perfect, old habits die hard, and there were still instances where the toxic elements of military culture reared their heads. But now, those moments were the exception, not the rule. And when they did happen, they were addressed swiftly and openly, with the collective awareness that such behaviors would no longer be tolerated. There was also a renewed sense of community. For years, the base had been a place of isolation for many soldiers, particularly women and minorities who felt like they had to navigate a maze of unspoken rules and unacknowledged barriers. But as the culture shifted, so did the dynamics. Soldiers began to work together more cohesively, not out of obligation, but out of respect for one another's humanity. Bonds formed not just over shared hardships, but over shared values. And as these bonds strengthened, the base became not just a place where soldiers were trained to fight. It became a place where they were trained to be better people. Of course, there were still those who resisted. There were whispers in the hallways and side conversations among the more traditional officers who had been uncomfortable with the changes. Some of them remained vocal in their criticism of the softening of the military, but even they had to admit that the new culture was having a tangible impact. The incidents of violence, harassment, and bullying had diminished significantly. Soldiers were beginning to feel like their voices were being heard, whether in official channels or just among their peers. There was a growing realization that respect wasn't just a buzzword or a new policy, it was a cornerstone of an effective, cohesive force. For Miller, the transformation of the base mirrored her own journey. She had begun as a victim, an individual who had been subjected to violence and mistreatment, but who had refused to remain silent. Now she was part of something larger, something that was bigger than her own pain. The changes on the base weren't just about personal healing, they were about the healing of a community, one that had been fractured by toxic behavior, but was now being rebuilt on the foundation of mutual respect. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, setbacks, and failures, but the trajectory had shifted. Miller could feel it in the air, the base had changed, and so had the military. For the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. The battle for justice had been won, but the war for cultural transformation was ongoing. However, she now knew that with each small victory, they were moving closer to a future where soldiers didn't just follow orders. They upheld the values of respect, integrity, and accountability that were essential to a true, honorable military. As the sun set on the base, casting its warm, golden light across the rows of barracks, it was hard not to see the undeniable shift that had occurred. The base, once a place of silence and fear, had become a symbol of transformation. What had started with one woman's courage to speak up had evolved into a movement that was reshaping the very culture of the military. And while the journey was far from over, it was clear that a new chapter had begun, one defined not by the mistakes of the past, but by the potential for a better, more inclusive future. Corporal Miller stood at the edge of the training field, watching the soldiers as they prepared for their evening drills. The sight of them, focused, disciplined, and working together, was a reminder of how far the base had come. There was no denying the challenges they had faced, nor the hardships that still lay ahead. But for the first time in a long while, Miller felt like the work they were doing was truly meaningful. The reforms, though still in progress, had laid the groundwork for a culture that valued respect, accountability, and mutual support, and she had played a part in that. Turner's fall from grace had been the catalyst, but the real change was much bigger than just one individual. It was about rethinking what it meant to be a soldier, to be a leader, and to serve within a system that valued more than just obedience. It was about creating an environment where soldiers could thrive, not just as warriors, but as human beings. This shift was not just for women or marginalized groups, it was for everyone. Every soldier, no matter their rank, no matter their background, deserved a military that valued them, that supported them, and that held them accountable for their actions. Miller's journey had been difficult, marked by pain, isolation, and betrayal. But through it all, she had remained resilient, using her voice to shine a light on the darkest corners of the system. She had become more than just a victim of violence. She had become a symbol of the change she had helped bring about. And as she reflected on everything that had happened, she knew that her actions had left a lasting mark, not just on the base, but on the entire military culture. The generals, too, had changed. General Hayes, who had been instrumental in pushing for reform, had come to realize that leadership wasn't just about making tactical decisions or winning battles. It was about ensuring that every soldier under your command could serve with dignity and respect. The journey for Hayes and his fellow generals wasn't over either. They had learned that true leadership required constant reflection, adaptation, and accountability. They had set the stage for a new kind of military, one that would continue to evolve and grow as it embraced these values. Though there were still those who resisted, who clung to outdated notions of power and control, their voices were becoming quieter. The culture of fear, of unchecked behavior, was slowly being replaced with one of mutual respect. It wasn't a perfect system yet. There were still lessons to be learned and setbacks to overcome. But for the first time, there was a collective understanding that the military could be both strong and compassionate, disciplined and just. It didn't have to be one or the other. For Miller, this was the beginning of a new chapter. The personal healing that had begun with the exposure of Turner's actions had transformed into a broader communal healing. She had helped to foster an environment where soldiers no longer had to endure the same mistreatment she had faced. And she knew that as the years passed, the military would continue to grow, continue to evolve, and continue to honor the values of respect, integrity, and accountability. She wasn't just looking at the present moment anymore. She was looking at the future and the legacy of change she had helped to create. Standing there, watching the soldiers train under the fading light, Miller felt a sense of peace wash over her. The base, the place that had once been a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in her life, had now become a place of healing, transformation, and hope. The legacy of the past was no longer defined by fear or violence. It was defined by the courage to speak out, the willingness to stand up for what was right, and the collective strength of everyone who had joined together to make the base and the military a better place. The journey was far from complete, but Miller was no longer walking it alone. She had seen the power of unity, of soldiers standing together in support of one another, and she knew that, with time, the military would continue to evolve. A new era had begun, one where respect and accountability were the pillars that held the system